Just kind of has that temperament of like, who really needs this thing anyway? What a waste of time. It's just so much money we waste and we just spend stuff. It's just this holiday for materialism and focusing on vanity and things like that. Some people feel that way. And one of the biggest challenges for the whole Christmas season is the story of Christmas itself. It just seems so ridiculous, so unbelievable that angels and a baby being born to a virgin and all this stuff. You say, I don't know. I just don't believe it. But what we talked about last week, if you missed last week's message, I really want to encourage you to go back and listen to it, because we talked about the backstory, the story leading up to the birth of Jesus, and even the things that followed the birth of Jesus. Even to this day, there's this promise. 2,000 years before Jesus was born, a promise was made to a man named Abram, and that promise was that God would bless the entire world. Every tribe, tongue, nation, people, family would be blessed through Abram's descendants. We know him as Abraham today. Everybody in the world. And Abram's like, I don't know how that's going to happen, but because you say so, because you promised it, God, I will choose to believe you. 2,000 years later, a little Jewish baby boy was born. We know him as Jesus, and he lived this incredible life that changed the world. But when Jesus was born, nobody felt blessed by the descendants of Abraham. Nobody was worshiping their God. Really, those promises of blessing the world were about as out of reach as they had ever been, and nobody expected it to happen. Then Jesus' life changed the whole world, and now we have billions of people across the globe who worship the God of the Jewish people, the very same God that they mocked and ridiculed before Jesus. We have thousands of people, millions of people across the planet who have been blessed by the culture and the descendants of Abraham. Crazy how that has happened. And that's what we talked about last week. And when you understand the backstory, the Christmas story actually becomes not so much unbelievable, it becomes pretty remarkable. You say, wow, the impact that the story of Christmas has had has really changed our whole world. It's pretty remarkable. Nobody saw that sort of impact coming. If you remember last week, we talked about in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, where Paul is writing and he talks about Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, he says, when the set time came, the right time seemed like the wrong time in the eyes of most of the people. They didn't believe that the promise through Abraham could really come about. Most of them. There were some who were very zealous and set apart, but most people were just like, oh, what a joke. But in God's eyes, it was the right time. Because as we talked about last week, the Roman Empire was growing into its most influential. It was not long after this. They controlled the known world at that time. And they had this culture that was overtaking the world faster than their military could. They had a road system. They had a seaport system that connected all the major metropolitan areas. This avenue through which God could spread his good news to the world through the Romans. At the same time, we had the temple, which really was a failed system in Jerusalem. The religion of the Jewish people centered around their temple, and it was corrupt. Money was more important than morality. People cared more about God and being righteous than they cared about the people that God cared about. So they would pass by somebody who was hurting or suffering so that they could go and worship. That sort of hypocrisy was just so prevalent throughout the temple system, very corrupt, very broken. And that's when God said, now is the right time. And he sent his son. Don't pass over this. We've got the Son of God, okay? God himself becomes a person. He sends his very likeness, his very substance, his very deity, born of a woman. This is not something to gloss over because this is a big deal, because God, the Spirit, becomes a human, fully God. It's crazy. Why would he do this? And then born subject to the law. What does that mean? Well, the Old Testament, the Jewish people, God had made a covenant with them. And there's all these Old Testament laws. And if you fulfill the law, then there's going to be this blessing that comes about. But nobody could fulfill the law. And I don't know if you've ever read through the Old Testament. You should. You shouldn't just take my word for it. You should go check it out and read through it. You got things like the 10 Commandments. Don't murder, don't steal, don't have an affair, don't worship any other gods. Those things make sense to us. There's also a lot of really obscure laws in there. They're like, what is that about? Like, why does God want me to do that? Like some of the things that people get hung up on, like garments. You couldn't have linen and wool in the same garment. You say, why would you do that? You couldn't eat meat and cheese in the same meal. And people are like, I can't do that. There's cheeseburgers in the world. I can't resist. I can't resist. And so at some point, people fell. They didn't obey the complete law. Nobody could do it. Everybody failed again and again and again. Thousands of people over thousands of years until Jesus. Jesus was the human who completed and fulfilled the law. And that enabled him to basically live out his purpose, which is what Paul points out in the second part of this verse, in verse 5. God sent him because he had obeyed and fulfilled the law. He could buy us freedom from the law for those of us who were slaves to the law. Why were we slaves to the law? Because at some point, we had broken the law, which condemned us. If you break the law, there's a punishment, there's a consequence. And breaking God's law, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, you break the author of life's law, you deserve to have life taken away from you. And that's a debt that we can't pay, right? But Jesus didn't break the law. He fulfilled the law, and now he can set us free. He says, I'm going to set you free. And it's like you take somebody who was living in slavery and say, I'm buying you out, and now you're a part of my family. You're not just going to live in my backyard in the grandmother's quarters, right? You're in my house. You get to wear my ring. You get to have my name. You're a part of my family. God is doing something so personal through the Christmas story that he had to come in person. Something so personal. That's what the Christmas story reveals to us, is that God doesn't just care about nations and big corporations and stuff like that. He cares about people. He cares about people like Abraham, like Mary, Joseph. How do we know these people's names? Because God chose them and because God did something really powerful and personal through them. So what we're going to talk about today, what we talked about last week is that the world needed Christmas. Today we're going to talk about that God needed Christmas too. And to try to set this up, I've heard it explained this way. If you have kids that are teenagers or young adults, you probably can really relate to this. My kids are little. I have 5 kids, 2 sets of twins. I have 10-month-old twin boys, a 3-year-old boy, and then 6-year-old boy-girl twins. They're actually sitting right over there. And I know that if I blink my eyes, they're going to be teenagers really soon, right? And what happens, I hear about this, where as a parent, you're trying to convey to your kid that you have their best interest. He's like, I'm trying to do things. The things that I ask you to do are in your best interest. I don't sit around coming up with ways to make you miserable. Like, if you could just know that I love you and the things that I ask you to do, I'm doing it because I care about you. And you try to explain that to your kids and your teenagers and your young adults. And what do? Their eyes gloss over. Whatever, Mom. And they turn into Napoleon Dynamite. Whatever. Are you finished? Like, I know that I did that to my parents. I feel bad about it. But if that's a challenge for you to literally look eye to eyeball with your kids and to try to convince them, I care about you. Would you just trust me? Instead of thinking that I'm always trying to hurt you. Think about the challenge that God has. The Spirit of God, intangible, like you can't, seemingly unknowable, like we would not know him unless he revealed his truth and revealed his word to us. How does God demonstrate to you and to me that he loves us in a way that we can actually comprehend and appreciate? How could God say, listen, I love you this much, would you just trust me? The answer is Christmas. How would we know where we stood with God if God had not come to stand with us? And how would you know where you stood with God if God had not come to stand with you? He chose to come and to demonstrate how much he cares about you. Another miracle wouldn't have done it. Jesus did plenty of miracles and people still rejected him and killed him. Another prophet wouldn't have done it. They killed the prophets. Another letter wouldn't have done it. We've got the most popular book in the world and people still don't read it. God had to come in person, the person of Jesus Christ, and demonstrate how much he loves us. Because actions speak louder than words, don't they? I think that's what Paul was trying to capture when he wrote a letter to Christians that lived in the city of Rome, which that in and of itself is sort of crazy. That there were people in Rome just a few decades after Jesus had been executed who thought that he had raised back from the dead and that he was the Son of God. Isn't that crazy? It just kind of lends itself to what I believe is a fact, that Jesus rose back from the dead. And you can do with that what you want. I think that him coming back to life means that he's the Son of God. And the people in Rome thought the same thing, some of them. And so Paul, one of the people who thinks that Jesus rose back from the dead, which means that he's the Son of God, he wrote a letter to Christians that lived in that city, and he talks about this a little bit. He said, God demonstrated his love for us. Can we throw Romans chapter 5:8? There we go. God demonstrated, he showed, he revealed, he acted it out. He demonstrated his own love for us in this, in the way that the prophets had hinted at, in the way that the Holy Scriptures had pointed to. What did he do? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Maybe you've heard this verse before, and you've thought, and you've reflected, and you've prayed, and you said, yeah, I think, and you feel guilty about the things that you've done. You say, yeah, Jesus died for me, knowing that I would do those things. But think about Paul and the people that he was writing this letter to. They were alive, most of them, when Jesus was executed. Like during their lifetime, literally while they were still sinning and living in rebellion against God, Jesus died while they were living, while it was happening, while they were still sinners. And this was especially personal for Paul. Paul was a hater of Christians earlier in his life. He hunted down Christians, arrested them, sometimes even executed them. And if you don't like Christians, I think you might get along with Paul, because he really didn't like Christians either. You should go read his books and his writings. But then he saw Jesus, the guy who I guarantee you, Paul had been one of the guys to cast his vote to say Jesus should be executed, because he thought that Jesus was mocking God, that he was a false Messiah, that he should be executed. And then God raised him back from the dead. And he goes, oh, I guess I was wrong. I guess he is the Son of God. I guess God didn't want us to kill him. We murdered someone that was sinless and blameless, and God raised him back up and said, nope, you killed the Holy One, the righteous one of God. I have vindicated him to show you that he is the Son of God. Paul is scared to death. He's like, I killed God's son. He's going to come now. The guy that has been hunting and arresting others, he's like, God's going to hunt me down. He's going to send me to hell for eternity. And instead, Jesus chose him and said, you are going to be my messenger. It was crazy for Paul to think, while he was hunting down and arresting and trying to stop Christians and the followers of Jesus, Jesus died for him. God, knowing that he would do those things, still died for him. So for Paul, Jesus' death was just the biggest demonstration of how much God loved him. Another question that we kind of lead into is the question that maybe you don't feel like we're allowed to ask. Like, can you ask that question in church? And if someone were to ask you, be like, I don't know, but you're not supposed to question these things, right? And maybe it's the question that maybe you decided you're not going to be a Christian because nobody's ever answered this question. It seems like a very foundational question, and it is. Why did Jesus have to die? Why did the Son of God, in this beautiful story of a newborn baby laid in a manger, and all of those that are even living in poverty are announced? They're the first ones to hear. The shepherds out in the field, they're the first ones to hear, you're welcome into the kingdom of God. Come welcome this new king. Why did he grow up and then have this horrific, unjust, merciless execution? So bloody and so violent. So why did it have to be so, not only why did he have to die, but why did it have to be so crazy and violent and gruesome and bleeding out and tissue? You can see he's so cut open on his back, it's tissue, and crown of thorns, and he's nailed to a cross. And why? Why did he have to do that? Well, if we think about a demonstration, if Jesus wanted to forgive everybody's sins, why didn't he just have a big demonstration at the end of his life before he ascends back into heaven, and he just says, hey, everybody, I talked to my dad. You guys are all forgiven, taking care of it. Stoner Jesus here. Hey, everybody. Talk to dad. It's cool, bro. Good. Sins gone. Like, why didn't he just do that and say, I talked to dad, sins are forgiven, you don't have to worry about anything anymore, you get to spend the rest of your life in heaven, eternity, that starts. Why didn't Jesus do that? I think it's pretty simple, a couple reasons. First off, nobody would have believed him if he did that. You know why? Because he had already told them that their sins were forgiven several times. There are multiple times, several of which are recorded in the New Testament in the Bible, you can go read them, where Jesus would heal somebody and then he would follow it up and say, oh, by the way, your sins are forgiven. And they would freak out. The religious officials would be like, whoa, wait a second. They wouldn't freak out that he healed somebody, which is what they should have been excited about. They freaked out because he said, you can heal. You can forgive other people. They said, you can't forgive everybody's sins everywhere. You can forgive people that sin against you, But you can't forgive people that sin against other people and their sins against God. No mere mortal can forgive everyone's sins. In fact, this is one of the reasons why they killed Jesus, because he went around forgiving people. I mean, does this sound ridiculous? They killed a guy for forgiving people. One of the main reasons that they did it. He said no mere mortal can forgive people's sins. But Jesus was no mere mortal, was he? If Jesus had just stood up on a hill and said everybody is forgiven, they wouldn't have believed him because they already didn't believe him. But maybe a more important reason why Jesus had to die for us, and this is what's so powerful and so personal, is because God is the author of life. He's the creator, he's the sustainer, he's the one who breathes life into this world and made it happen. Out of nothing, God created everything. I recently, just this week, saw a quote from Martin Luther that said, God can create life out of nothing, so as long as we are nothing, God can do something with us. He doesn't need anything from you other than nothing in order to do everything in your life. He's the author, the creator of life. Everything that you do is because he gave you life. He's the sustainer and the author of life. Every day we should wake up and say, God, thank you for this life. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. Thank you for health. Thank you for my kids' life. Thank you for my husband, my wife's life. Thank you for my parents. Thank you for them. Thank you. How could I possibly resist you, God? You've given me life. This is the best gift. I would not exist without you. How could I possibly say no? Anything you ask me, the answer is yes. Yes, 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 yes. And yet, every single day, pretty much, we say no. And we resist God and we go against him and the things that he's trying to do in our hearts and in our minds. We say, no, I want to do things my way. You don't choose the day that you're born. Hopefully you don't choose the day that you die. But within that span, there will be a point where you raise your fist to God and shake it and say, no, I'm done with you. I don't trust you. I don't like you. I don't love you. I don't think you love me. I don't want to follow you. I don't think you have what's best in mind for me. So I'm going to do things my way. And we resist him. When you dishonor the author of life, you deserve to have that foundational gift of life taken away from you. Because that's the essential thing. He gave you life and you chose to rebel against him. You owe God your life. But that's not a debt that you can pay, right? You can't die and keep going. You can't die and then live because you're dead, right? You can't do that. You can't die and then live again, but the Son of God can. Do you understand that? The Son of God can. That's what's so powerful about Jesus. He's no mere mortal. He's fully God, fully human. He was able to pay this price, to take his life, to put it in our place. We owe God our life, but he takes his immortal, eternal self, dies, and then breaks through it. God raises him back up and really just blows a hole through the whole death thing. So now death cannot stop us. Now we will follow his pattern, and there'll be a point in the future where we continue on for eternity. That's a powerful thing that Jesus came and did for you and for me. God is the author of life. He, knowing that you couldn't pay the price, but loving you so much, said, I'm going to pay that price for you. And I'm going to do it in such a visible, obvious, documentable way that you can see it and hear it and know about it. And there'll be people talking about it every Sunday at churches across the world to try to let you know that God loves you that much. And if you would just know and receive that, would you then trust him? Say, I think God has my best interest at heart. That's why Paul said, God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. After Jesus died, and then God raised him back to life, his very same disciples, his followers, who when Jesus had been arrested and executed, fled and hid because they were terrified. They're like, if we're around Jesus, I mean, we were his followers. If they do this to Jesus, what are they going to do to us? They'll arrest us. They'll execute us too. So I'm out. And they pieced out and they disappeared. Those very same guys are so emboldened and so courageous just weeks later that they walk back into the very same city, Jerusalem, the very same streets that Jesus had been dragged through after being arrested and whipped. Outside of those walls is where he was arrested. And then on the other side of the city is where he was executed. They walk back into that same city and start telling people that Jesus had come back to life because they believed. And they saw and they witnessed that this guy that had been executed, God raised him back to life. And they say, you know what? We were scared before, but then God brought him back, and now we're not scared anymore. What are you going to do to us? You going to kill us? Because you killed him, and it didn't stop him. So you can kill us too, and he'll just raise us back up. And so this is what they do. They step out into the streets, eyeball to eyeball, with some of the very same people that had arrested and executed Jesus. And they start saying stuff like this in Acts chapter 3. They say, you rejected the holy righteous one. They're talking about Jesus. You rejected him, you executed him, you killed him, and instead you demanded the release of a murderer. You demanded the release of a murderer. I don't know if you know this part of the story, but when Jesus was on trial, the governor Pilate knew that the whole thing was a sham. He's like, this guy is innocent. He has done nothing wrong. They're questioning him, and it's like, there's nothing here. And the governor had this crazy riot that was basically going on outside. It wasn't a riot, but the people were riled up, and they were ready to see some blood. They had bloodlust. And so he said, okay, here's what I'll do. Let me release Jesus, and instead, I'll execute this murderer. He's been on trial. Let's execute him. Barabbas was his name. We'll kill him, and that way, we get to kill somebody who will satisfy the bloodlust of the people is essentially what he does. The people and the religious officials were so corrupt that they riled up the people in the crowd. They voted to release the murderer and set him free, and to instead execute Jesus in that moment. And in that moment, they chose to release someone who had taken life, and instead they killed the person who came to give life. So you rejected Jesus, the Son of God, and demanded the release of a murderer. You guys are so unjust. And then he follows it up. He says, you killed the author of life. They called Jesus the author and the creator of life. But God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this fact. They said, we were there. We were there when he was arrested. We watched from the shadows as he was on trial. We saw as he was dragged through the streets, and we saw his body on the cross. And then 3 days later, he appeared to us resurrected. He came back to life. We are witness of this. We saw the whole thing. God did something crazy to demonstrate and to pay the price for our sin, just to show you that he loves you. So the severity of what Jesus went through reveals several things to us about this demonstration. Jesus' death demonstrated the magnitude of our ingratitude. We are so turned against God. We are so depraved and so broken that God had to himself come in. He tried to give us the way. Here's the law. Live this out. There'll be the blessing. We couldn't do it. Knowing that, he prepared and sent his son to pay that crazy price. That's how ungrateful we are for what he's done in our lives. Jesus had to die for us. But the beautiful thing is the second part of this. Jesus' death demonstrated the magnitude of our ingratitude, and his death also demonstrated the magnitude of his love for us. And this is what's so important. You know that you cannot demonstrate love without action. Your love has to be shown to be known. You can't just say, I love you, I love you, I love you. At some point, you got to prove it, right? Got to put a ring on it. If you really... You really love, you keep saying it, but let's walk down the aisle together. Let's do this, right? If you really love me, you'll do this thing. You'll demonstrate it. If you really love me, you'll come home from work on time, and you'll prioritize our family, or you'll come to the T-ball game. Like, prove it. You can say it. And how does God, who claims that he loves us, demonstrate to a physical world, and so many of us have our hearts and our minds and our backs turned against him? We're just not even paying attention. How does he demonstrate to us in a way that we could understand and process and appreciate that he loves for us? And that's what Paul's grappling with here. He's trying to say, listen, God demonstrated his great love for you with a great and necessary sacrifice. That's why Paul, I read Romans 5:8 earlier, but if the verse before, he says something great. He says, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. I mean, you might die for someone that you really like or that you support, somebody that you voted for. You'd be like, I'll take a bullet for them. Or somebody who's really valuable to the community, or celebrity. You say, I listen to their music all the time. I love them. I'll take a bullet for them. But at the same breath, there's certain people that you say, I did not vote for them. I'm not taking a bullet for them. I did not like them. I don't like their music. I don't like what they do. I don't like that neighbor. Let them rot. I'm not dying for them. But that's the difference between us and God. God died for his enemies. He died for people that don't like him, who resist him, who reject him. He died for people like you and me and like Paul, who was an enemy of Christians. And that's what he's saying here. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us, for people who don't deserve it, for people that he loves. So when the full time had come and the Roman Empire was expanding and there was an avenue for God to give his message to the whole world, when the full time had come and the temple system was so corrupt and failed, that's when Joseph, a Jewish carpenter, found out that his fiancée was pregnant, and not by him. He's trying to figure out, what do I do? And what do I do with her? Do I shame her? The Old Testament law says stone her. Do we stone her? Do I lie about this? Do I cover it up? Do I tell her mom? You got to tell her mom? What do I do? And that's when an angel of the Lord came and spoke to Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, verse 20. It said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Then it goes on, and he quotes the words from the prophet Isaiah, which these words were said and recorded hundreds of years before Jesus was born. The prophet said, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. And this is what's so powerful. This is the thing that takes God, who's separate from us and set apart, and we're physical and he's spiritual. And this is the thing that brings it together and makes it so personal, is that the name Emmanuel means God is with us. Can you say those words with me on three? 1, 2, 3. God is with us. He's here. And he demonstrated it. And here we are 2,000 years later talking about a Jewish boy who was born in the armpit of the Roman Empire. How does that happen? How does that happen? He did it so that you would know. It's not enough to say it. It's not enough to send another prophet or another message or do another miracle. He had to show by sending his son to pay the price, to die the death that you and I owe, so that we could be set free from our sin and be brought into his kingdom. That's the power of the story of Christmas. He wanted us to know so that we would trust him. So I would never want to give a message like this without giving people the opportunity to respond. Like, maybe salvation is such a strange thing, isn't it? Like, you can hear the story about baby Jesus your whole life and go to church around Christmas and you hear the story about baby Jesus, and then you go at Easter and you hear the story about Jesus dying on a cross. Maybe you never knew, oh, that's the same person. And the dots start to connect and you start to feel like, wow, this is the Son of God. He did this for me. And salvation is a crazy thing, right? Because you can hear these stories and never realize, why did Jesus have to die for me? And I don't appreciate what God has done. And I don't know that God is for me, and I don't know that I can trust him. And then you hear something like this and you're like, oh, God would do that for me? God was willing to go through that for me? I think I can trust him. And if you've never done that before, I want you to demonstrate that you trust Jesus today for the first time in your life. And it's gonna be crazy, it's gonna be bold, but I'm gonna ask you to do something that you will never forget. And maybe when you were a kid, they asked you to come forward and you went forward because everybody went forward. And they asked you to get baptized and you got baptized because everybody got baptized and everybody got a cake afterwards. But as an adult, you've thought it through and you may think, man, I got questions. I don't know. Why did Jesus have to die for me? How can I know that God loves me and cares about me? How can I trust him? God demonstrated it by sending his son, born of a woman under the law, to fulfill the law and to die and to pay the price that you and I deserve to pay to set you free so that you could have eternal life with God and be a part of his family. So personal. So what I want to ask you to do, since God demonstrated that for you, I want to ask you to do something. I want you to demonstrate today that you trust him. I want you to do something that's bold and courageous. Just like the disciples went back into that very same city where Jesus had been executed, and they walked out into those streets and boldly said, God raised Jesus back to life. We are witnesses of this. We believe this. And he's not going to hurt you because you killed him. He's going to save you and forgive you. He's paid the price to bring you into his kingdom. Would you join us? That sort of boldness. And what I want you to do today, if this is the first time in your life that you are connecting the dots, if this is the first time in your life that you're feeling like, you know what, I can trust God. I want to ask you right now to stand and to say the words, I believe. Right now. If that's you today, stand and say the words, I believe. Maybe you're feeling God tugging on your heart. I mean, we're such an introverted culture and people. You're thinking, I don't know if I should stand. What are they going to think? We're going to celebrate. At Compass, we love when people stand and say, I'm not ashamed of what Jesus has done for me. Stand and say, I believe. Who's not ashamed? Say, I will stand and say, I believe. You reel this in a little harder. Oh, yes. Good for you. Fantastic. So proud of you. That's victory right there. There's boldness. It's contagious. It's contagious. Anybody else want to stand and say, I believe? Good for you. Yes. That's right, Ed. Proud of you, Ed. Say it, Carla. I believe, yes. I'm proud of you. If y'all are new here, you're like, this place is crazy. But I want you to know that we care about you. Jesus said something that is crucial. It's so powerful. It shows you that he, as your king, has your back. Look at what he said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 32. He said, everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. We've got a great opportunity today to live out that promise. Anybody else want to stand and say, I believe? Good for you, Kirsten. I'm so proud of you guys. I really, really am. I just want to do something personal myself. If you stood, I just want you to come meet me right over here at these tables right now. And I just wanted to pray over you before you leave today. Would you do that with me? If you stood, will you guys clap for this? Just stood boldly. I'm going to walk with you. You can come with me. Not by yourself. I know. Can you stand up and come with me? I'm so proud of you guys. I just want to pray over you before you leave today. Thank you guys so much. Merry Christmas.